My name is Julia Pascucci, and I'm a sophomore at the University of Delaware studying biology. The civil rights movement had many key leaders paving the way in the fight to gain equal rights, including one woman named Amelia Boynton Robinson. This is my project on Amelia Boynton Robinson and the Dallas County Voters League and her impact on the push for Black voting rights. Amelia Boynton Robinson was born on August 18, 1911, in Savannah, Georgia, where she grew up alongside her 9 siblings and parents. As a child, Amelia took an interest in voting rights, campaigning for women's voting rights with her mother, Anna Platts. In 1920s, Amelia and her mother had a horse and buggy and would drive women in the neighborhood to go to the county registrar's office to get registered to vote. This wasn't an easy or safe job, especially for a child. Amelia's father, George Platts, only continued his education to the 3rd grade, but that does not mean he was uneducated. George was self-taught after dropping out of school in the 3rd grade, and Amelia describes him as a mathematician focusing on problems relevant to his work. He ran a major logging company and was extremely successful economically, owning multiple enterprises and a woodyard. In the early 1920s, she attended Tuskegee University, helping pitch in and pay for her own education. After graduating and gaining a degree in home economics, she went on to work at the Dallas County office in Alabama, where she met her husband, Sam Boynton. At the time, even though Black people represented half of the southern Alabama community, only 1% of Blacks were entitled to vote. Obstacles such as poll taxes, literary tests, and voting poll protests were protected by local laws in order to prevent Black voter turnout. There were no Black lawyers in southern Alabama, and a Black man named C.J. Adams served as Dallas County's notary public and first Black legal advisor. In 1918, Adams founded Selma's first NAACP chapter and soon later founded the Dallas County Voters League. Both organizations had low memberships due to the oppressive racial conditions in Selma and fear of retaliation. The Dallas County Voters League in particular quickly attracted police retaliation. C.J. Adams was imprisoned several times for falsifying documents, forcing him out of Alabama to live in Michigan. However, before departing in 1948, Adams gave leadership of his NAACP chapter in Dallas County Voters League to fellow member and local activist Sam Boynton and his wife Amelia. Amelia and her husband opened an insurance company to employ both of them, protecting their family from any job retaliation and gaining greater financial independence themselves after gaining leadership of the Dallas County Voters League. Shown is a picture of Amelia, Sam, and their 2 sons as a young family. The insurance office they owned also served as a meeting place for the Dallas County Voters League monthly meetings. Under Sam and Amelia Boynton's lead, the Dallas County Voters League worked locally to help pass multiple civil rights acts. The passing of 2 civil rights acts were campaigned for the Dallas County Voters League under Amelia and her husband's initial leading. The Civil Rights Act of 1957 and 1960 began to make noticeable progress in the push towards voting rights, but the enforcement of these acts were not common practice for years to come. Unfortunately, in the late 1950s, Sam Boynton suffered a series of strokes leading to his death in 1963. As Amelia Boynton Robinson saw her husband losing his life at the peak of their civil rights fight, she began taking on an even more prominent role in the Dallas County Voters League. In 1962, prompted by her dying husband's wish for equal voting rights, she contacted civil rights organizations and saw that his civil rights work was continued after his passing. The Dallas County Voters League changed under Amelia's direction as Sam battled health issues, holding multiple voting registration drives in the 1950s. These drives were extremely successful in increasing the number of Black voters, but were also attracting white retaliation. The year of 1963, specifically, was a change of momentum for the civil rights movement, and Amelia Boynton Robinson and the Dallas County Voters League made strides in the fight for justice. Selma's first mass meeting for voting rights was held at a church and attracted much more people than in subsequent years, packing the church full. Sheriff Jim Clark and his team of a makeshift police force came to the meeting, vandalizing and smashing cars outside, daring activists inside to challenge them. As more and more people were inspired to take a stand in the civil rights movement, monthly meetings grew to weekly meetings, and in the summer of 1963, hundreds of people applied for registration. Harassment and retaliation from Sheriff Jim Clark and the rest of the local government in Selma continued to grow, but the right resistance Blacks had been fighting for so long did not stop them. The Dallas County Voters League, founded by C.J. Adams, had started with small monthly meetings in the Boynton's insurance office, and now they were renting out churches to hold weekly meetings with hundreds of members there in support, despite increased retaliation from the local community. The Black community in Dallas County, Alabama, had come together to demand voting rights, and the goals of the Dallas County Voters League had finally the community support it needed. During this time, 8 members in particularly were leads in the voting rights movement, together forming the legendary Courageous 8. The Courageous 8 continued to meet in spite of the local court injunction that had prohibited more than 3 people of color from meeting. Amelia Boynton Robinson was one of the Courageous 8 members, and each individual part and member of the Courageous 8 was a prominent leader in the civil rights movement before coming together and bringing their own followings to the Dallas County Voters League. The members of the Courageous 8 were all freedom fighters, putting their own lives at risk to change the voting rights of the future. In December of 1964, Amelia Boynton Robinson and the Courageous 8 invited Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. to come to Selma. One photo included here shows Dr. Luther King Jr. alongside Courageous 8 member Reverend F.D. Reese. On February 18, 1965, 1 month after Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. spoke on behalf of the Dallas County Voters League in Selma, Jimmy Lee Jackson, a Black activist, was shot during a civil rights demonstration by Corporal James Fowler. Jackson was a Black activist who had spent his night protesting the wrongful arrest of Reverend James Orange. The murder of Jimmy Lee Jackson sparked a famous series of marches in Selma, Alabama. 3 marches were arranged, the first one being on Sunday, March 7th, led by John Lewis, where 600 marchers gathered in a somber mood. This march turned to Bloody Sunday, as marchers were attacked and beaten by police with clubs and tear gas. All members of the Courageous 8 participated in this historic march, including Amelia Boynton Robinson. At the Bloody Sunday March, Amelia was one of the many protesters attacked, as she was beaten unconscious, and photos of her circulated in the national media. National television coverage of the Bloody Sunday triggered a national outrage, as shown in some of the videos included in this slide. As the marchers did not reach Montgomery during their first march, a second march was led by Martin Luther King Jr. to revisit the Edmund Petty Bridge where they had been attacked on days prior, this group being over 2,000 people. The group gathered at the site of the Sunday attack, coming together to kneel and pray on the bridge. After prayers, the marchers went back to Selma, instead of pushing on to Montgomery to avoid police confrontation. In no way was this a way to back down, but at this point, Martin Luther King Jr. and the Courageous 8 had finally been able to have a voice in the federal government pushing for peace. The push to Montgomery continued in its final march on March 21st. Martin Luther King Jr. met with President Lyndon Johnson to draft the voting rights legislation and share his views on reformation, after which President Johnson submitted voting rights legislation to Congress. Historians say that the Selma to Montgomery marches were the catalyst leading to the enactment of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 was finally a law that had enough support behind it to be enforced, working to abolish discriminatory voting practices. In 2015, Amelia Boynton Robinson was escorted alongside then President Barack Obama across the Edmund Pettus Bridge in honor of the 50th anniversary of the Bloody Sunday March. Later that year, at 104 years old, Amelia Boynton Robinson suffered several strokes and passed on, forever being a key leader of the civil rights and Black voting rights movement.